Hello and welcome to another tutorial. My name is Matt Cervantes and I am a computer science professor at Butte College. And so in this video, I'm going to be walking through the basics of using the command line interface, or a CLI as it's sometimes called, for an operating system. Now the primary audience that I'm intending for this video is the folks who are going to be taking or are currently taking a programming class with me. But this information is certainly useful to anyone who is just interested in becoming more familiar with the command line. So I'm going to put it up on YouTube, and then it'll benefit anyone who would like to have this information. Now, to kind of get things started with this, though, I'm not kind of detour from the command line interface, and I'm actually going to talk a little bit about something else, and hopefully kind of work our way towards the command line from some place that I'm hoping everyone is comfortable starting out. And that is a thing called a GUI. All right. Now, the first thing if I say that GUI, what is a GUI? Well, a GUI is just a graphical user interface, right? And the reason I want to start here is because this is what I would assume most people are familiar with when dealing with a computer. And really, the thing that sets a GUI apart from a CLI is that a GUI allows a person to interact with the computer with minimal keyboard input. Now, it's kind of hard to never type anything to a computer. That's sort of one of the primary ways. But if you have a really good GUI, you can reduce it down to very, very little. And that's what most really successful programs nowadays do, right? And so I've already kind of mentioned this, is that GUIs are really the primary interface that are used by pretty much most people today. And there's a few reasons for that. The most obvious one is that they're just more intuitive. GUIs are far more intuitive than what we're going to talk about with the CLI. And this is what has kind of given them the edge. They were certainly not the starting point, but they are now clearly the dominant way that people interact. And they also provide a common foundation. So when GUIs kind of came out and they started becoming very prevalent, everyone kind of became on the same page. You no longer had to get into the details of your specific computer system, because this graphical user interface kind of provided this nice foundation that could make it easier for you to talk to other people about computers. So that's another reason why they're so prevalent today. And probably the last, and I don't want to understate this, but it is true, that they're just much prettier to look at. And so that's one of the reasons why people use them today. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here, right? And I figured I'm just gonna demonstrate using a GUI. So hopefully everybody here, you can see my desktop, and this is what you're used to on your computer. Now, obviously, I'm doing this on a Windows-based computer, but this is true now on pretty much any major operating system. So if you're using a Linux distro or you're on Mac OS X, it doesn't matter. They all have some sort of graphical interface, and your desktop, which is a pretty common word now, is a graphical representation of your computer, right? And so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do something that's hopefully very familiar to everybody. If I want to do something, let's say I want to make a folder on this computer, well, I can just come over here and right click, new folder, right? And then this thing pops up. And then I can just type in here folder one, of course, because that's the name every programmer gives their folders, right? So I'm just going to call it that, and bam. So I used my mouse, I right clicked, and look what I created, a little thing on my desktop. Now, if I want to see the contents of that folder, I can double click on it, right? And then this pops up, like this wonderful little window thing pops up, and it's nice and friendly and very easy to understand. It's this thing, and it's empty right now. It even have a little picture on here that looks just like an actual physical folder, so it's much more intuitive, right? So I get in here, and now let's say I want to make a file inside of this folder. Well, I can just right click again, new text document, let's say, and then this thing shows up, and now I can write a name for my file. So I'm going to call it file one, because that's just how I roll, right? And there we go. So now, just with a few mouse clicks and dragging things around and very little typing, actually, I was able to actually create a folder on my computer and then put a file in it. And then if I wanted to put some content into this file, I can double click on it, and then, oh, look, a program opens, right? Notepad opens on the Windows operating system. And now I can come in here and now I can actually type some information in here. So some information in the file. Look at that, right? And then I'll save it. I'll close this, right? And so this is how most people, I think, are used to navigating and doing things on a computer, right? And again, you can nest the folders. I can even come in here and I can create another folder inside of this folder. I'm going to make it subfolder 1. Look at that. That's great. Okay. And so this is, again, all this 99% of what I'm doing here, mouse, right? And right clicking and doing that kind of stuff. And so this is what, when I say a graphical user interface, this is what you're used to. Okay. So now I'm gonna kind of contrast that a little bit with what a command line interface does in a few moments. But before I venture into that, I do want to point this out because I'm trying to make this tutorial as universal as possible. If you're running on a Mac or you're running on like a Linux distro, the one thing I will point out that's a little different here is that on a Windows machine, they do have these things, this little file extension. So see how this says file.txt? If you did the same operations on Mac or Linux, you may not get this little .txt file. And so I did want to point this out because even though it's only kind of tangentially related to this topic, it can be confusing to folks. So I went ahead and I made a little slide to talk about this a little bit. I did want to mention this. So on a Windows-based computer like I'm on right now, that file extension, that little .txt that you saw, the operating system itself, the Windows operating system uses that file extension as a way to know what kind of programs are associated with the file itself. So really, if I broke out of this again, you can see that when I double click on this file with my mouse, all right, how did it know to open up Notepad? Well, that's because if you right click on it again, if you go over here to properties, it actually, you can see right here, if I'll zoom in a little, that the type of file, it says it knows that it's a .txt. It actually uses that extension as a way of knowing it, and then it knows, well, whenever I see a .txt, I open it with this thing called Notepad. And you can actually change that if you want. You can change this, and you can have it from here on out. I can use Visual Studio Code if I want to open up .txt files, right? And if I clicked on this and then clicked OK, that's exactly what would happen. Now I'm not going to do that because I actually like mine opening up with Notepad, right? But that's the idea behind it. So with that in mind, that's not necessarily how it works on other operating systems. So I just want to point this out. So if you are following along and you're on a Windows machine, I'm sure that made perfect sense. If you're on a Mac or Linux, right? Mac and Linux don't actually use file extensions. Well, they do, but the primary way that they associate files with a particular program is through a thing called a MIME type. Now, I'm not going to get into it, the details of it. So MIME stands for multi-purpose internet mail extensions. Okay, so it's actually a really old idea. It's from like email time. All right, but it's been widely adopted now. So basically, what it boils down to is the information about what program should open up that file is actually baked into the file itself, rather than it just being the name of the file. They actually put the information into the file. Now you can also, and I put this as a little bonus thing here, those operating systems, Mac and Linux, they both can use extensions, and some of them do, but it's not required. So I just don't want that to throw anybody off if I'm doing something in Windows world here that that isn't equivalent in Mac or Linux universe. Then I'm just trying to draw that attention here. So, but it's okay, right? It's the same ideas are there. You can create files. You can, I'm sure it's right click or do some sort of clicky thing on your mouse, and you can create files and folders. Okay. So now that I've done all of that, now I'm going to do basically the exact same stuff that I just did, except I'm going to do it now with a different interface. Instead of using a graphical user interface, I'm going to use a command line interface. So in the Windows operating system, there's two of these, but I'm going to use the one that I like most. So here I'm going to do this. I'm hitting the command key. I guess you guys can't see this. I'm going to just do PowerShell. Okay. I'll drag it over here so you folks can see it. So this is what I'm talking about when I say CLI. So in the Windows world, Windows PowerShell is a kind of CLI that you can use to navigate and interact with your computer. So the first thing I want to draw attention to here is this little bit right here. It says C colon backslash users mat. Okay, this is actually telling me where I am right now on the computer in this command prompt. Okay, and that's very different than how you're used to seeing it if you're used to using a graphical user interface, because in a graphical user interface you don't really, this is sort of just intuitively understood where I am. It's just by proxy of me, like I'm here, my mouse is here. When I click on things I go into these folders and I can go further down into folders like this, right? It's more intuitive, right? But in the end, this is actually the same thing as here. And you can always tell that, at least in Windows. I'm not sure if this is true in Mac and Linux, but I assume it is. You just come up here to this little address bar at the top here. And here, I'll zoom in again. Oop, oh boy, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, well, we'll just leave it that way, I guess. If you click here, look what you can see. It'll actually show you exactly where you are right now. So I'm on the C drive in a folder called users in a subfolder mat, subfolder desktop, subfolder folder 1, right? And that's just where I happen to be right now, okay? And so when I do this on a command prompt, command line, right? It's just more explicit. It just tells me that's where I am right now. So based on what I just showed you, you can tell that I'm actually in a different place. This is in a different place right now than this is. So if I wanted to get from where I am in the command prompt to where this folder is, I'm going to need to be able to move around. So on the GUI right now, I'm in C users mat, and then I'm in another subfolder called desktop. So the easiest way to do this, and this is one of the first commands you're going to need to know how to do in a command prompt, is to do cd. So cd, oh boy, that was weird. All right, you type cd space, and here I'm going to get out of that because it's doing weird stuff, right? Cd space, and then you just type the name of the folder you want to go into. So I happen to know that there's something called desktop, right? And boom, there I am. I can see now that I am in. I'm going to be doing a lot of zooming in and out, I guess, to do that. So now I'm in the desktop, right? Isn't that great? Now let's say I want to go even further down. So I know now that this is in users, mat, desktop, and another folder called folder 1, right? So let's go ahead and do that. cd folder 1, right? And I hit enter, and look where I am. Now I'm in a little further. And so at any point in time, you can always just see where you are. Now on a Linux or a Mac machine, this might not be here depending on what shell you're running. And so there's a command that can also just tell you where you are at any point, and that's pwd, right? And it'll work in PowerShell as well. It's basically just the path, right? And so right now when I typed pw, it literally told me exactly where I was, although I already knew it because of the way this shell is set up. So you could also do this command in a Mac or Linux, and then you would know exactly where you are. Okay, so now that we know where we are, that's good. But that was me cheating a little, right? Like I knew where I was because I was using this GUI over here to kind of help navigate. What if I didn't know? What if I didn't know what was in folder 1? Well, lucky for us, there is another command that is good to use, and that is the list command, or ls. So if you just type ls in a folder that you happen to be in and hit enter, it will show you every single thing inside of that folder. So look where I am now. This is telling me in this mode thing, there's a whole kind of coding that you need to know if you want to understand this better. But in the end, the D stands for a directory. So it's telling me this thing called subfolder 1 is a directory or a folder, right? And then this other thing, A, is actually telling me this is a file, right? And I named it file. So there they are. So there's my subfolder 1 and there's file 1, just like I had in my GUI over here. They're the same things, right? So there's a way to navigate around. So you can use CD to just navigate your way down, down, down into whatever folder you want to get into, right? And then you can use LS to see what's inside of every folder as you go, right? And so I can take this another step further. I can do CD folder or subfolder 1, right? So I need to go subfolder 1, right? And now I'll do LS again, and there's nothing in it, right? So nothing shows up when I do LS, as you would expect. I can also type clear here in PowerShell, and it'll just wipe out everything that was there. That's nice. Okay, So now I'm in subfolder. So now let's say, okay, I don't want to be in subfolder. I want to get back up here to where file 1 was. So that's the other thing you can do. You can do cd space dot dot, and that'll take you up a directory. So I'll just zoom in here so you can see that a little. So I was in subfolder 1. I did cd space dot dot, and that took me up back up to folder 1. So you can always use the dot dot to represent one folder like above where you are. So let's say I went here, subfolder 1. Goodness, this is going to be the fun part that I do all day here. Let's do this. Whoops. Okay, there we go. Subfolder 1, right? I'm back in subfolder 1. Now let's say I wanted to go up 2 directories. I could do cd dot dot slash dot dot. And now look where I am. There, do this again. See, now it took me up from subfolder 1 up to folder 1, right? And then it went up one more to desktop. So now I'm here. So this cd command is kind of your ticket to navigating around in your computer. So here I'm going to go back down into folder 1. I'll do ls, and look, there's all the stuff that's in there as we saw before. Okay, so that's cd and ls. Those are probably your biggest useful commands on the command line. Now, let's say I want to be able to look at that file. Well, there's a couple commands you can do. I'm going to show you cat. If you do cat file 1, that'll actually just show you and just spit out to the terminal what is in that file. So look, here it is, some information in the file. It's just telling me exactly what's in it. So it's the same as if I had double clicked on this and just looked at it here. It's the same thing. Isn't that neat? All right. But let's say I wanted to edit this file. Well, if I wanted to edit it, this is actually where Windows is a little different than the other operating systems. And in Windows, there's no way to do that in the command line, right? So you actually, it's the expectation is that I'm going to open up some sort of a program to do the editing. And in this case, that program, the computer knows, well, if it has a .txt file on it, that means I'm going to open it with Notepad. So if I just type in the name of the file, file1.txt, and hit enter, look what opens. It just automatically opens up the program that I can use to edit it. And then I can edit it all I like. Some information, here's more info, right? I'll hit save, and I'll close it, right? And now here what I'll do, I'll cat that information out, and it'll actually have the new information right there. Isn't that great? Okay. So you can navigate around, you can look in the files, you can run the files. Let's say I want to make another folder. You can do mkdir, and I'm going to make another folder in here, subfolder 2, let's say. And look what I just did. I just made a folder, and then look what happened. If you look up here in the back in the graphical user interface, look what it made. It made subfolder 2. It just sort of showed up as soon as I did that. So the point I'm trying to make here is that this interface right here is doing the exact same thing that you're doing when you click on things in the Windows GUI, right, or any kind of GUI. There's no difference between what they can accomplish, just the way in which they go about it. So in this interface, in the command line interface, you kind of need to know these commands. You need to know things like cd or ls or mkdir, right? There's a few other ones, and I'm going to show you those in a second. But I wanted you to be aware that that's really what we're talking about. That there's really nothing you can't do in the command line that you could do in the GUI. They're exactly the same thing. Okay, so I've already showed you sort of the basic commands that you can use on the command line interface to navigate around and make directories and stuff. But there's really no end to the number of resources available to you to be able to figure out all of the commands available, and that's really what the internet is for. And so I actually went ahead and found these. I'll put these in the description of this video. And I like this one in particular because this one actually is showing you that the equivalent. So this is why one of the reasons why I use PowerShell so much is that it mimics the same commands that Linux uses, and Linux and Mac kind of use the same ones. And so in this particular one, you can see, well, here's pwd, like we just talked about. There's cd, there's ls, find. We didn't even talk about that. You can copy, you can remove, make a directory, you can touch, all sorts of great stuff. And so I would highly encourage you to do your own Google search, but I will share this one. And then this will also just act as a list of things that you can go find. I found another one here. This one's actually more unique to Linux, but hopefully you can see the similarities here. This is just the Linux basic commands, and what do you see? The same stuff: pwd, cd, ls, cat. Right? They're all very similar. In fact, for being really honest about it, Microsoft, when they made PowerShell, they kind of blatantly ripped off the same commands that that Linux had already. So if you learn PowerShell sort of setup, then you're kind of already set up pretty well for ever transitioning over to one of those other operating systems as far as the CLI is concerned. Now I am going to pause here for a second. I'm going to kind of go back to what we were doing previously. I'm going to go back to my slide here. All right. But I do want to talk about the different types of command line interfaces that exist. So as you just saw, I'm using PowerShell inside of Windows, right? But obviously different operating systems have different tools available to them. So I just kind of made this list to help you out. So on a Windows computer, there are really two different command line interfaces. There's the older one, I suppose, is what's called the command prompt. And sometimes people will just call it CMD, right? And this is actually in modern Windows operating systems, this is really just a kind of a throwback to the old DOS operating system. And so I will demonstrate that really quickly just because I happen to be on a computer. So I can open up I can hit the window key on my computer, type CMD, right? And then this thing will show up, and it's black instead of blue, I guess. Right? And it's actually a different program than PowerShell. PowerShell is a different command line interface, and they have little tiny differences between the two as far as most of the commands. Although the reason why I'm using PowerShell is because it's much newer and far more robust. This is actually a very old. It's emulating DOS really, and there are some little differences in just the syntax, but mostly there's just a lot of this tooling that most people would like to be able to use nowadays just doesn't exist here. But you can do simple things like you can CD, and I can go into desktop again, right? And here I am. I can CD into folder 1, I think that's what it calls. Yeah. And then now here's the thing, a funny difference. There's no such thing as ls here. It doesn't know what that is. Because back in the old DOS days, they used the word dir, and now that's how you can see what's inside of it, right? So there's other little nuancy differences, but in the end, it does effectively the same thing. I can make directories, I can copy files, I can launch programs, I can do all that same stuff from here, right? But I'm going to encourage anybody who's in my class, and frankly anyone I talk to just use PowerShell if you're on a Windows computer. Okay, so that's kind of the Windows world, right? So there's the command prompt and there's PowerShell. Now, if you're on Mac or Linux, there's actually a bunch of different shells that are pretty common among those two operating systems in particular. So the most common one by far is Bash, right? And so if you open up like on a Mac, you can open up the terminal, I think is what they call it. You're running Bash, I think, by default. And Linux, I think Bash is the but they have other ones. They have TC shell, Z shell, sometimes, and then they have like the corn shell, right? So I think these are the four that are just kind of there by default on Linux and Mac. You don't really even have to do much. I think there's some commands you can run to switch if you want. These are the different things, and much like how the command prompt and PowerShell have small differences between what they can do and what they can't do, that's sort of the same thing happening on these operating systems. Okay, and the other thing that Linux has is Linux actually has many more command shells that it has available to it. I certainly couldn't enumerate them all here, but I wanted you to be aware of that those differences exist. Okay, so so now let's talk about, now that I've kind of demonstrated, like, so what is CLI? It is a command line interface, and it allows the user to interact with the computer primarily using a keyboard, as you saw me. So everything that I was doing, I was just typing it. I wasn't using the mouse. I wasn't having to do much, mousing around or using the graphics of the computer. I was just typing where I wanted to go, and it was taking me there. And the thing about the CLI is that it pretty much for every operating system, it does require a slightly deeper understanding of that computer system to be able to kind of accomplish your goals. And this is what is sort of off-putting, I think, to most people. But if you're interested in getting into computer programming and wanting to explore that as a as a career path or even just an interest, you're going to want to get comfortable with the command line interface because the I've never seen a program, an education program, that didn't initially teach computer programming on the command prompt on a terminal like this. And so this is where you're going to spend a lot of your time. And the kind of programs that you'll run, just like how I was in here and I could just run a program like Notepad, you could just type Notepad and it'll just open it up, right? Just like that, you can run command line programs that when you run them, the output is not like a graphical thing that pops up, but actually information that shows up here in the terminal. And that's why you start there, because that's kind of where it all begins. All right, well, that pretty much wraps up this video. Hopefully I demystified a little bit of what the command line interface is, and folks can get going and start digging down deeper into computer science. All right, thank you. Have a good one.